A little girl from a small town went to a stadium with her mother to watch a little league baseball game. While the mother sat in the stands, the girl wandered off to play with other children nearby. Her mother watched her from the stands, but when she looked away for even a second, her daughter had vanished. The police quickly intervened and uncovered several disturbing clues. However, for almost 30 years, the girl's fate remained a mystery until a few weeks ago when the truth finally came to light. Morgan Nick was born on September 12, 1988, in the small town of Ozark, Arkansas. Shortly after her birth, her parents welcomed a son, and a year later, another daughter. Morgan had a wonderful relationship with her younger siblings. They could spend hours playing together, and the little ones admired her in every way. When she was just starting to learn to read, Morgan practiced with children's books, reading stories to her brother before bed. From a young age, she was also an animal lover and used to tell her parents that she wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. In elementary school, Morgan joined the Girl Scouts, where she enjoyed doing crafts, going on nature hikes, and simply enjoying time with the other girls. When Morgan was 6 years old, her parents decided to divorce, but the girls were still able to spend a lot of time with their father. In the early summer of 1995, a family friend invited Morgan's mother to a little league baseball game in a nearby town called Alma. At first, she thought about declining. After all, it was a Friday afternoon, and the stadium was almost 30 miles away. But in the end, she decided to go and take Morgan, thinking it might be a fun way for them to spend time together. On the afternoon of June 9th, Morgan's mother left the younger girls with their grandmother and headed to the stadium. Although it was a small venue, about 300 people had turned up for the game, including parents and other children. She found her friends and they settled in to watch the game. But Morgan soon became bored. After a while, she saw two boys she knew who invited her to play and catch fireflies near the stadium. At first, her mother hesitated to let her go. It was already getting dark and it was the first time they had visited the town, so she was worried that something might happen to her. But her friends assured her that their children played near the stadium all the time and that there was nothing to worry about. Reluctantly, she let Morgan go, and the little girl ran off with the other children. They stopped by a small hill, which her mother could still see, and she kept an eye on Morgan from time to time. About 15 minutes later, the baseball game ended, and the players began heading to the stands to meet their parents. Morgan's mother looked away for a few seconds, but when she looked again, her daughter was gone. The two children she had been playing with were heading toward the stands, and Morgan wasn't with them. The woman approached the children and asked if they had seen her daughter. They explained that before returning to the stadium, they had stopped to shake the sand off their shoes after playing. They went over to a car in the parking lot, leaned against it, and emptied their shoes. Morgan stood behind the car while they walked in front. When they finished, they started walking back to the stadium, but Morgan was nowhere to be seen. Her friends assumed she had stayed near the car waiting for her mother, so they didn't think much of it and continued on their way. Morgan's mother looked toward the parking lot and saw her car, but there was no sign of Morgan. She hurried to look inside, but her daughter was nowhere to be seen. She began to panic and went back to the children, hoping they could shed some light on Morgan's disappearance. She asked them where her daughter might have gone, but they had no idea. They did mention, however, that they had seen a man in the parking lot while they were playing. He was standing near a red pickup truck watching the stadium and occasionally glancing in their direction. At one point, he even approached them and said something, but they couldn't remember his exact words. They only remembered that he spoke with a sort of rural accent. Thinking that this man might have had something to do with her daughter's disappearance, Morgan's mother immediately called the police. 6 minutes later, officers arrived at the stadium and spoke first with the children who had been with Morgan before she disappeared. During their conversation, the police were able to get more details about the man near the stadium. By piecing together the children's accounts, investigators concluded that he was a white man between 23 and 30 years old, about 6 feet tall, of medium build, with a beard, mustache, and dark hair. The children also remembered his vehicle quite well. It was an old red pickup truck with Arkansas license plates and a white camper trailer attached to the back. This detail seemed suspicious to the officers because an adult, let alone a child, could easily fit inside the camper. Another strange thing was that the camper seemed unusually low for the truck. making it look out of place for that model. This further fueled suspicions that the man might be directly involved in Morgan's disappearance and that he could have used the camper to abduct her. The children also mentioned that the man was only wearing jeans and no shirt. The officers immediately searched the parking lot, but were unable to find any vehicle matching the description. After speaking with the children, they began questioning everyone who remained at the stadium. However, the 300 attendees were focused on the game and none recalled seeing anything unusual or suspicious that night. The search of the stadium also proved fruitless, so officers expanded their efforts to the nearby streets. Despite their best efforts, no trace of Morgan was found that night. Her mother was devastated. He refused to go home and ended up spending the rest of the night at the fire station. The next day, the search intensified as news of Morgan's disappearance spread rapidly throughout the area, leading dozens of volunteers to come forward. Soon, the FBI and state police joined the efforts, providing helicopters for aerial searches and creating a composite sketch of the suspect based on descriptions from Morgan's friends. The portrait, along with photos of Morgan, was distributed throughout the town and nearby communities in the hope that someone would recognize the man. Initially, authorities also thought Morgan had simply wandered away from the parking lot and gotten lost. But as nearly 24 hours passed without any sign of her, it became clear that if that had been the case, they would have found her by then. That afternoon, police also began receiving alarming reports from parents who shared some disturbing stories. A woman told them that, just hours before the baseball game, a stranger had tried to lure her 4-year-old daughter into his red pickup truck. It happened near a laundromat in Alma while the woman was inside and her daughter was standing near the building. When the mother came out, the man left. She provided a description of the suspect that matched the sketch of Morgan's possible kidnapper. The day after Morgan's disappearance, another report came in from a witness in Fort Smith, a town not far from Alma. She saw a man trying to lure a 9-year-old girl into a public restroom, but the girl managed to escape. Once again, the man's description matched the composite sketch based on accounts from Morgan's friends. All of this pointed to the possibility that the person behind Morgan's disappearance might have attempted to abduct other victims previously or even successfully committed similar crimes in the past. Police focused on locating the red pickup truck that matched the witness's description and began checking the backgrounds of known criminals in nearby towns. Over the next few weeks, investigators received hundreds of tips about potential suspects, but were unable to establish a connection or confirm that the individuals were not involved in the crime. Meanwhile, investigators continued combing the area around the stadium, collecting various items that could be considered evidence. They found several cigarette butts, bottles, and other objects that were sent to the lab for DNA analysis. But in the end, the police had no clear indication as to whether any of these items were actually related to Morgan's disappearance. Regarding the red pickup truck, police received nearly 250 calls from witnesses in various cities and even neighboring states, all reporting sightings of similar vehicles. The problem was that many residents drove similar models, and there were literally thousands of them. Investigators tried to investigate each property owner, but once again, they found no evidence linking any of them to Morgan's disappearance. This continued for 2 weeks until the police received a surprising call. A resident of a town called Stoutgard, about a 3-hour drive from Alma, was on his property when he saw a man trying to break into his car. The owner scared him off, and the intruder immediately fled. As he fled, the witness saw that the man was holding a little girl's hand. Police showed him the composite sketch of the suspect, and he confirmed that the person trying to get into his car looked very much like the suspect, and the girl resembled Morgan. Investigators quickly launched a large-scale operation in Stuttgart, securing an area of about 10 square miles and deploying several dozen officers. Morgan's parents immediately headed to the village, hoping they would finally find their daughter. Hundreds of volunteers, along with the police, began searching the entire village and its surroundings. Helicopters conducted aerial searches, and search dogs attempted to detect Morgan's scent of her belongings. The search continued for 16 hours, but no trace of the missing girl was found. Finally, the police began to doubt the witness's story. He underwent 2 polygraph tests, and both suggested he was lying. Although the man insisted he was telling the truth, He eventually admitted that he had made up the whole story. He saw someone trying to get into his car, but he couldn't get a good look at the person's face, and there was no child with him. The man was arrested for providing false information, which cost him nearly a full day of searching and thousands of dollars. It's unclear whether he faced any punishment, but this type of action usually results in a hefty fine or jail time. The investigators found themselves back where they started. But giving up wasn't an option. They brought in 17 more agents from across the state, and the team focused on classifying the incoming leads. By then, they had over 1,500 leads, but none of them brought the detectives any closer to finding Morgan. Her parents didn't give up either, but as the months passed, their hopes began to fade. About a year after Morgan disappeared, her mother found a non-profit organization dedicated to finding missing children. Although she remained focused on finding her daughter, there were no new leads to follow. It was then that she began helping other families going through similar tragedies and worked to raise awareness about the dangers that could lurk at any point in a child's life. Over the following years, the police followed several leads and questioned potential suspects, but nothing seemed to yield any results. In 2001, 6 years after Morgan's disappearance, the FBI released an image showing what she might have looked like. That same year, several well-known television programs aired segments about her case, which led to an increase in the number of leads. Although most of these leads turned out to be dead ends, one in particular caught the investigators' attention. The caller claimed that the girl's body was buried on a property in Boonville, a small town an hour away. The police took this lead very seriously because the person provided specific details about the case that had never been made public. In early 2002, they obtained a search warrant for the property. They brought in search dogs and excavated the entire area, but found no trace of Morgan. Since then, the case remained closed for almost a decade. In 2010, police received another lead about a possible location where Morgan's kidnapper might have held her, this time in another state. They conducted a search, but once again, there was no evidence to suggest the girl had been there. Interestingly, in 2017, police searched the same house again, but this time for a different investigation. It turned out that a man who had lived there was in prison for crimes against minors, and authorities suspected him in another similar case. But even then, the search yielded no new leads. In 2019, a new documentary about the case was released. For the first time since Morgan's disappearance, police released a photo of the red pickup truck believed to be connected to the kidnapper. The vehicle had been briefly captured on camera during the game, but the poor quality and angle made it nearly impossible to discern any important details. Following the release of the documentary, the police contacted the public to ask for any information about who might have owned the van. They received a number of new leads. But despite these efforts, they were still unable to make any progress in solving the case. This continued until 2021, when investigators finally named their prime suspect in the case. The man was Billy Lynx, who had come to the attention of the police in the first few weeks after Morgan's disappearance. Lynx had a criminal record for offenses against minors and owned a similar red pickup truck. However, in 1995, the police were unable to establish any connection between him and Morgan's disappearance, even after searching his truck. During his questioning, they felt that Billy was being honest about his innocence. He was also significantly older than 30, whereas detectives relied on accounts from Morgan's friend that described the kidnapper as younger. Now, almost 30 years later, detectives began investigating him again. This time they hoped that modern DNA analysis tools could uncover any trace of Morgan's presence in his vehicle, but there were some problems. Billy had died in 2000 while serving time for an attempted kidnapping. Just 2 months after Morgan's disappearance, he tried to lure another girl into his car while she was standing in front of a store. Her mother scared him off and reported the incident to the police, leading to his arrest. At the time, he was 70 years old and died of natural causes 5 years later while still in prison. Another complication was that the police had no idea where Billy's truck was or if it still existed after almost 3 decades. The investigators focused on tracking the truck and, after some time, managed to trace its chain of ownership back to Billy's arrest. To the detectives' surprise, they found the truck. It was still running, and the current owner agreed to let the police examine it. Initially, the The detectives weren't getting their hopes up, since any DNA evidence could have easily been erased or degraded over the years. But surprisingly, forensic experts found some hairs on the truck bed that appeared to match Morgan's hair. The samples were sent to a Texas lab equipped with the latest DNA analysis technology for further examination. It took 8 months, but a breakthrough was finally achieved. They managed to extract a DNA sample from the hair and compared it to Morgan's mother's DNA. The results indicated a close genetic match at first degree of kinship. In other words, the hair likely belonged to one of her children or siblings. Morgan's mother stated that she had never heard of Billy Lynx and had never met him in her life. Detectives also knew that no one else from Morgan's immediate family could have been in that van, meaning that Morgan herself must have been there. On October 1, 2024, police held a press conference to announce that Billy Lynx was now officially considered responsible for Morgan's kidnapping, and they had no doubt about his involvement. Sadly, no one believes Morgan could still be alive nearly 29 years after her disappearance. Investigators suspect Billy killed her in the first few days after the kidnapping, but the whereabouts of her remains are still unknown. Although the case is considered essentially solved, police have stated they will continue searching for her remains. Still, without a confession from Billy, this task seems almost impossible. Detectives will also investigate Billy's possible involvement in other cases. Given that he had attempted at least a few kidnappings shortly after Morgan's disappearance, police suspect there could be many more crimes in his past. At the time of the kidnapping, Morgan was already 70 years old, and it seems likely that he had a long history of such crimes. In addition, he had served in the army during World War II, which gave him certain skills that could have been used in his crimes. It's worth noting that Morgan's disappearance became one of the most well-known crimes in all of Arkansas. Authorities even decided to rename the Amber Alert system the Morgan Alert in her memory. As for her mother, she continues to help other children and families through her nonprofit organization. This work has been her way of coping with the loss of her daughter. Although deep down, she still clings to a small hope that Morgan might be alive somehow. Share your thoughts on the story in the comments section, and don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thanks for watching. Two girls went to the park on their bikes and disappeared. This marked the beginning of events that were incredibly hard to believe. From the very beginning, the story resembled a detective thriller with an unbelievable plot. As things unfolded, it became even more puzzling until all the mysteries converged into one solution. Laura Hobbs was born on September 25, 1996, in Texas. Later, her parents had 3 sons, but soon after, the couple separated. Laura's mom moved with the children to the small town of Zion in Illinois. Laura loved this place. Her maternal grandparents lived there, and she quickly made new friends. Moreover, Zion was located on the shore of Lake Michigan, and she enjoyed going there with her relatives. In the spring of 2005, when Laura was 8 years old, her father decided to reconcile with his wife and move back into the children's lives. He relocated from Texas to live with the family. On Sunday, May 8th, it was Mother's Day. Laura, along with her brothers and parents, went to the lake to celebrate the occasion and fly kites. They had a great time, and later Laura wanted to go for a walk with her best friend, 9-year-old Crystal. The girls attended the same school and lived close to each other. When Laura moved to Zion, they immediately became friends and spent almost all their free time together. They visited each other's homes, played near their houses, and rode bikes. Sometimes, when Laura's mom didn't allow her to go out, Crystal would come to her window and they would talk. On that day, they decided to take their bikes and go to the park, which was only a few hundred yards from their homes. They often went there since the park was very close, and it had a long bike trail. Despite their age, parents weren't afraid to let their daughters go there because both girls knew the area well, and serious crimes in the town were extremely rare. The girls left around 3 p.m. and were supposed to be back for dinner. However, as time passed, their parents started worrying. When it was 7 p.m. and Laura and Crystal still hadn't returned, they decided to go to the park and call them home. To the surprise of the adults, the girls were not there. They walked along the bike path calling their names, but there was only silence in return. Other relatives and friends of the families quickly joined the search. They continued to search the park and also went through the streets of their neighborhood, hoping to find them. This went on for several hours until it started to get dark. By 9 p.m., the parents realized that something might have happened to their daughters, and they decided to contact the police. The police immediately joined the search efforts. They contacted volunteer organizations and enlisted the help of several dozen volunteers, as well as search dogs. In addition to this, local residents who heard about the girls' disappearance also joined the search. The police focused their efforts on the park area since the girls were supposed to go there. Speaking to other children living along the route from their homes to the park, the police learned that Laura and Crystal did indeed pass by them, stopped to chat, and mentioned that they were heading to the park. Parallel to the search, the police went door to door in the neighborhood in hopes of finding anyone who had seen the girls that evening. They also began distributing flyers with information about their disappearance. As each hour passed, it became increasingly evident that something terrible had happened to the girls. Darkness had already fallen, and they were being searched for throughout the town, but there were simply no traces of Laura and Crystal. The search continued practically until dawn, and at around 4:30, the police decided to take a break. However, Laura's father and her grandfather refused to return home and continued scouring the area. They went to the park and decided to split up to cover more ground. Around 6 a.m., as the first light of day began to break, Laura's grandfather suddenly heard a cry and rushed in that direction. He stumbled upon Laura's father, who was in shock and claimed to have found the bodies of Laura and Crystal. They lay off the bike path amidst thick undergrowth. Laura's father immediately realized that both girls were dead, as there was a lot of blood and injuries on them. The man called the police, and they arrived promptly. After examining the bodies, forensic experts determined that the cause of the girls' deaths was multiple stab wounds, most likely from a knife. Laura had 20 such injuries on her body, while Crystal had 11. This news sent shockwaves through the small town. Such crimes were almost unheard of there. But now they were faced with the horrifying reality that an unknown assailant had killed 2 young girls just a few hundred meters from their homes. The police focused all their efforts on finding the culprit. Their initial suspicion fell on Laura's father, Jerry. They were concerned by the fact that he had managed to find the bodies alone after the park had already been searched by officers and volunteers. Digging deeper, they discovered that Jerry had a significant criminal history, ranging from drug-related offenses in his youth to assaults on people. One incident in 2001 had led to his wife and children moving to another state. On that day, while they still lived in Texas, Jerry and his wife had a heated argument that quickly escalated. They were in front of their home, and 3 men passing by noticed the situation and intervened, thinking the woman was in danger. Jerry became infuriated and went to get his chainsaw, then started chasing those men. Eventually, they managed to subdue him and hold him down until the police arrived. Jerry faced charges, and a year later he was sentenced to 10 years of probation. As part of his probation, he was required to regularly check in with his probation officer, but he missed one of those appointments. Consequently, his probation was revoked, and he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. He was released from prison just a few weeks before the tragic deaths of his daughter and her friend, and he had come to Zion almost immediately after his release. For the police, it was clear that Jerry had a propensity for aggressive behavior. However, they had no evidence or motive, so they invited him for questioning. He agreed to go to the police station, and investigators gradually began to press him about his involvement. Over the course of more than 20 hours of questioning, Jerry initially denied any involvement in his daughter and her friend's deaths. He insisted he had nothing to do with it, and claimed that he and his wife noticed Laura hadn't returned. So he went searching. He said he continued searching until he found the girls' bodies in the park. However, later on, Jerry suddenly started changing his story. In the end, under the relentless pressure from detectives, he began to confess. He said that on that evening, he did indeed went looking for his daughter and saw her in the park with Crystal. He scolded her for going out without permission and demanded that she come with him. However, she refused, and he grabbed her arm, attempting to take her home. She resisted, and her friend Crystal also demanded that he leave the girl alone. According to Jerry, Crystal took out a small knife from her pocket and pointed it at him. This infuriated Jerry. He seized the knife and inflicted multiple stab wounds on both girls, then left their bodies in the overgrown part of the park and walked away. Later, by morning, he allegedly found the girls and personally reported it to the police to divert suspicion from himself. During this confession, Jerry was in tears, but he still signed his admission statement and repeated it on camera. "I was walking on a dirt trail and I ran into Laura and her friends Crystal on the trail. I told Laura that she had to come home and she argued with me and I grabbed her by the arm. She tried to pull it away and was telling me to let her go. Crystal also told me to let Laura go. Crystal pulled out a small eye from her pocket and again told me to let Laura go. Laura was biting me and I punched her in the face and she dropped to the ground." The relatives of the girls were shocked by this turn of events. None of them could have imagined that Laura's own father would turn out to be the killer. However, his wife later told the police that she had always known about her husband's propensity for aggression, considering his previous criminal offenses. Nevertheless, the man admitted his guilt and was subsequently arrested, awaiting trial and prison. Soon, the prosecutor announced his intention to seek the death penalty. The preparation for the trial dragged on, and during this time some intriguing developments occurred in the case. Jerry was appointed a lawyer, and he suddenly claimed that he had no involvement in these murders. According to him, he confessed under immense pressure from detectives who had interrogated him for over 20 hours. He also alleged that they had threatened him and his family and subjected him to physical abuse. At that point, he had not slept for over 2 days and was in an extremely distraught state because he had found his daughter murdered and couldn't cope with the grief. The police began to tell him that if he simply confessed to the murders, they would release him and allow him to get some rest. They essentially formulated the most likely scenario of what had happened for him, and Jerry merely echoed their words. When the detectives pieced together a coherent narrative, they wrote down this confession for him to sign, and asked him to read the text from the paper on camera. His attorney immediately requested a case review, but it was swiftly denied. The prosecution argued that Jerry had confessed voluntarily and affirmed his statement on camera. Nevertheless, after retracting his confession, he had to go through a full-fledged trial with a jury, which prolonged his wait for several years. Following this, Jerry's lawyer discovered some significant details. Initially, he knew that there wasn't a single real piece of evidence against his client, and decided to focus on searching for any leads. He found out that the medical examiners had not even thoroughly examined the bodies of the girls. They had conducted all the standard procedures, like taking swabs, collecting debris from under the girls' fingernails, and so on. However, after storing these samples in the refrigerator, no one had considered analyzing their contents. The lawyer pushed to have all these pieces of evidence examined in an independent laboratory. The prosecution tried to obstruct his efforts, but he succeeded in his task. In 2008, the examinations were finally conducted, and there was a rather unexpected twist. It turned out that Laura's body had several different DNA samples on it. There was foreign skin under her fingernails, and male semen found on her clothes and in 3 places on her body. Simple analysis revealed that none of this belonged to Laura's father. It all pointed to a completely different man. This discovery unequivocally indicated that Laura had been sexually assaulted. As for Crystal, they did not find any foreign DNA on her body, but no one doubted that she was killed by the same person. Jerry's lawyer immediately requested his client's release from prison and the dismissal of all charges. However, an unpleasant surprise awaited him here as well. The district prosecutor refused to acknowledge the new evidence, claiming that it meant nothing. In his opinion, the presence of foreign DNA on Laura's body could have been entirely coincidental. He argued that young couples regularly visited that park for intimate encounters, and he believed that this was why male semen ended up on the girl's body, possibly from the grass or bushes. Even the fact that some biological samples were found inside the victim's body didn't seem to faze him. Despite the absurdity of this version, Jerry remained in prison, awaiting the start of his trial. Nevertheless, the lawyer managed to get the DNA sample entered into the FBI's database, but there were no matches. All he could do was wait and hope that the perpetrator would be caught sooner or later because there was no hope for reasonableness from the prosecution's side in Jerry's case. Let's fast forward 4 years and miles away from Zion. A 20-year-old woman named Amanda Snell, who had recently joined the military, lived in the military base in Arlington, Virginia. She decided to enlist because there were many military members in her family. Alongside her service, she occasionally helped a local church near the base. There, she taught children with autism and other developmental differences. Amanda quickly realized that she wanted to pursue this professionally and planned to get the necessary education after her military service. On July 13, 2009, she didn't report for duty, immediately raising concerns among her fellow service members. They went to her room, knocked on the door, but received no response. They discovered that the door was unlocked and entered. The room was impeccably tidy, the bed was made, and her belongings were neatly in place, but Amanda was nowhere to be found. Only after they opened the closet did they come across a horrifying sight. Amanda's lifeless body lay in an unnatural position with a pillowcase over her head. Initially, the medical examiners couldn't determine the cause of death, but they later concluded that Amanda died of suffocation. Her death had occurred over a day before her body was discovered. There were no signs of trauma on her body, and she had not been sexually assaulted. Investigators only found out that her laptop and tablet were missing from her room. When speaking with Amanda's parents, investigators learned an interesting fact. She suffered from severe headaches, and sometimes, when the pain became unbearable, she would retreat to a dark room and put a pillowcase over her head. Considering that Amanda was found in her own closet with a pillowcase over her head, detectives speculated that what happened might have been a dreadful accident. Nonetheless, they didn't rush to dismiss the murder theory. In front of her closet, they found a trace of a men's shoe, but they couldn't establish its ownership. Consequently, the investigation remained open, and investigators continued searching for a potential killer. In February 2010, a 26-year-old woman from Arlington exited the metro station and headed towards her boyfriend's home. In the middle of the street, an unknown man approached her, showed a gun, and demanded she get into his car. Despite the assailant grabbing her arm and brandishing a knife, the woman managed to break free. She threw her purse as a distraction and fled toward her boyfriend's house. Upon hearing her cries, he and his friends rushed onto the street and called the police. By the time they did, the assailant had already fled. Nevertheless, the woman could provide a detailed description of his appearance. She also remembered the model of his car, a beige Dodge Durango. Based on the victim's description, a composite sketch of the suspect was created, and the police began their search. 2 weeks later, on February 27th, 2 women from Arlington were returning home after spending the evening with friends. When they stood at their doorstep, an unknown man approached from behind, brandishing a gun, and demanded their wallets. After the women informed him they had no money, the assailant forced them inside the house and bound their hands. At one point he left the room, and one of the women managed to free her hands. She grabbed a phone and dialed 911. However, the man swiftly returned, snatched the phone, and smashed it against the wall. Subsequently, he grabbed one of the women, took her out to his car, and drove away. After covering some distance, he raped her, taped her head with duct tape, and strangled her with a scarf until she lost consciousness. She later regained consciousness in the snow by the side of the road when passers-by found her. She was taken to the hospital, where the police promptly arrived. The woman provided them with a description of the attacker and mentioned the model of his car, a beige Dodge Durango. Remarkably, just 2 hours before this attack, another woman had reported to the police. She told them that a man matching the same description and driving the same type of car had approached her on the street. He had attempted to coerce her into his vehicle, but she had used her stun gun on him and managed to escape. Investigators realized that they were dealing with a serial and highly dangerous criminal right in their midst. They focused their efforts on the vehicle, as it was easier to trace through databases. The police visited all owners of such cars, and soon they got lucky. During the inspection of one of these vehicles, they discovered a student ID belonging to the same woman who had been left to die in the snow, along with her earring. Inside the car they also found the same type of tape used to bind her head and a stun gun. The owner of the car turned out to be a 21-year-old named Jorge Avila Torres, who was serving in the military at the very base where Amanda Snell's body had been found several months earlier. Moreover, he lived in the same building as her, just a few floors below. During the search of his room, investigators found a pistol he had purchased less than a month ago, along with numerous rounds of ammunition. On his computer, they discovered a significant amount of explicit videos depicting violence and cruelty. Some of these videos featured women who were unconscious. Photos of Torres, along with pictures of other men, were shown to all 3 women who had been attacked. They all unanimously identified him. They remembered his face well because during the assaults, he didn't even attempt to conceal it. Following this, Torres was arrested and placed in custody pending trial. Investigators suspected him of kidnapping 1 woman and assaulting 2 others, which seemed likely given the evidence. However, they faced another problem when they began to suspect Torres of Amanda's murder. There wasn't a single piece of evidence linking him to the crime. So, detectives devised a clever plan. They planted an informant in his cell, someone willing to wear a wire and engage him in conversation. Surprisingly, this tactic worked remarkably fast. Within a week, Torres started confessing to his crimes. He openly boasted about killing Amanda, stating he did it just because the opportunity presented itself. He added that he did it for the adrenaline and provided a detailed account of how he placed her body in the closet. Torres also mentioned that after the murder, he had to meticulously clean her room to erase any traces. However, unknowingly, he left behind a piece of evidence during the cleanup. The criminal revealed to his cellmate that he had sexually assaulted the victim on her bed, using contraception. After moving her to the closet, Torres made her bed but removed the top sheet. However, he left the mattress pad, which the police immediately sent to the laboratory. There, experts found a tiny sample of male semen that matched Torres' DNA perfectly. Furthermore, Torres let slip to his informant that he had a pair of Nike sneakers that he kept in his car. Crime scene analysts seized the shoes and compared the sole pattern to the footprint found outside Amanda's closet. The sole pattern was an exact match. As a result, Torres was formally charged with murder, and he remained in custody awaiting trial. Meanwhile, a sample of his DNA had been uploaded to the FBI's database, and now we return to Zion. Several weeks after the sample was added to the database, local investigators got a perfect match between Torres' DNA and the semen samples found on Laura Hobbs' body. What followed was even more astonishing. It turned out that Torres was originally from Zion and was friends with the older brother of the second murdered girl, Crystal. This connection confirmed that both Laura and Crystal knew Torres, a fact corroborated by other kids in the area. At the time of the girls' deaths, Torres was just 16 and the police hadn't considered him a suspect at all. They were solely focused on Laura's father, who had spent 5 years in jail awaiting trial. Once the DNA match was found, Jerry's attorney demanded his client's immediate release and the dropping of all charges. This time the prosecutor couldn't argue against it, as the discovery of Torres's semen on Laura's body eliminated the possibility of her father's involvement. After his release, Jerry announced his intention to sue the police and authorities for coercing a false confession from him and making him spend 5 years of imprisonment. They quickly realized they had no chance of winning this case, and in the event of a loss, they'd be held accountable for their misconduct and incompetence. So, they offered him a settlement, which he accepted, receiving nearly $8 million. As for Torres, the legal process in Virginia concluded 4 years after his arrest. He refused to admit guilt, but the jury unanimously found him guilty. He was sentenced to death for Amanda's murder, and for the attempted abduction of 2 other women and the kidnapping of a third, he received 5 life sentences, plus 168 years in prison. Immediately after this, he was extradited to Illinois, where the trial for the murders of Laura and Crystal began. Initially, he denied his guilt, and his lawyer tried to argue that the semen found on the victim wasn't enough to prove his client's guilt. However, Torres was eventually presented with a deal. He was already facing the death penalty, and even if that were delayed for decades, as it often happens, he would never walk free. So, the criminal agreed to confess to the murders in exchange for an additional 100 years in prison and a transfer to a different facility, as he felt his life was in danger at his current one. The terms of the deal didn't require him to reveal all the details. It was sufficient for him to admit to the killings. As a result, Torres remains behind bars, awaiting the execution that has yet to occur. As for the police officers who coerced Jerry into signing a false confession, none of them faced any consequences. Jerry himself couldn't fully return to a normal life. He began using drugs and was arrested for resisting arrest, subsequently escaping from custody and receiving a 2-year prison sentence. He also couldn't reunite with his family and chose to live in Texas. After his release, he gave an interview where he admitted that the coerced confession had irreparably damaged his life. When asked why he had agreed to the confession, he said, "I found my daughter dead. They didn't even need to try to break me. I was already broken." Finally, it's worth adding that the local police and the county prosecutor's office did receive well-deserved criticism from national media and the public. If they hadn't fixated on a single suspect, but instead conducted a thorough investigation, they would have had a much better chance of catching the criminal much earlier. Instead, they inadvertently allowed him to kill 1 woman and attack 3 more. And these are only the cases we know of. Hi guys, my name is Brandon and today we'll delve into the case of a girl who went to her Sunday school and disappeared without a trace. The police and hundreds of volunteers searched everywhere but couldn't find the girl. This mystery remained unsolved for a whopping 48 years until an unexpected twist helped reveal the shocking truth. Gretchen Harrington was born on June 13, 1967, in Pennsylvania. She was the youngest of 3 daughters. Soon after her birth, the family moved to the small town of Brummel. Her father, who was a pastor, got a job at the local church. Gretchen immediately loved this town. She spent a lot of time outdoors with her sisters and new friends. Brummel was a safe place, so parents weren't afraid to let their children play outside until dark. With its rich nature and close-knit community, this place was more like a paradise for kids. Raised in a religious family, Gretchen spent a lot of time at her father's church. She also excelled in Sunday school, always getting top grades. On the morning of August 15, 1975, when Gretchen was 8 years old, her family eagerly awaited the arrival of her mother and newborn sister from the hospital. Gretchen also wanted to wait for them, but her father encouraged her not to miss Sunday school to keep her perfect grades. Reluctantly, she agreed, took her Bible, and headed to church. Usually, she walked there with her older sisters, but they both stayed home that morning. Gretchen wasn't afraid to walk alone, as the church was less than a mile away, just an 8-minute walk from her house. The Sunday school lessons consisted of 2 parts. First, the children gathered at Trinity Church, and after about an hour and a half, some of them headed to Gretchen's father church. But at 11:30 a.m., when the kids arrived at the second church, Gretchen's father noticed that his daughter was not among them. It seemed strange because the children were brought as a group. He thought Gretchen might have stayed at the other church, so he called there. Answering the call was the wife of the pastor, named David, who taught at the Sunday school. She said Gretchen wasn't there and told her husband about what was happening. He was surprised because Gretchen hadn't even attended his classes that morning. Her father immediately started to worry. He asked David to call the police and went searching for his daughter. The father drove along the route between the churches, checked other streets nearby, but Gretchen was nowhere to be found. He also reached out to her friend's parents, hoping she might have decided to spend time with some of them. But they were all either at church or home. Gretchen's best friend, David's daughter, also hadn't seen her all day. The police immediately began searching. As news of Gretchen's disappearance spread through the town, hundreds of volunteers quickly joined in. Practically all the locals knew Gretchen's father, as they regularly attended his church, so they all wanted to help. Together with the volunteers, the police searched the entire town, then started combing through multiple wooded areas and the riverbank. A police helicopter was also sent to assist, scanning the area from above. The search continued into the night, but yielded no results. The next day, even more volunteers joined in. The police created flyers with Gretchen's photo and information about her disappearance, which were posted along roads and handed out to passing drivers. Despite all efforts, not only did the police fail to find Gretchen, but they couldn't even determine what happened to her. After several days of searching, they didn't find any significant leads at all, and Gretchen's fate remained unknown. Her disappearance became a heavy blow to the local community. People were used to letting their children roam the streets freely from a young age, and nothing like this had ever happened before. The kids could spend hours wandering in the woods, swimming in the river, without adult supervision, and their parents never worried. But now, all of that was in the past. The fact that no one knew what happened to Gretchen only added to their fear. People discussed various theories. Some thought she might have run away from home. Others believed she went swimming in the river and drowned. But the most frightening theory was that someone had abducted her. Parents stopped letting their children out unsupervised. One local woman even cut her daughter's long hair so she would resemble a boy. Once a safe and peaceful town, overnight it became a place where people lived in uncertainty and fear. The police also questioned anyone who might have had any connection to Gretchen's disappearance. During these conversations, they received several intriguing leads. One witness reported seeing a girl resembling Gretchen near the church that morning. A green station wagon approached her, but the witness didn't see what happened next. Another person shared a similar story, but this time they said a white Cadillac approached the girl. The police followed up on these leads, checked the owners of all vehicles matching the descriptions in the area, but couldn't establish their involvement. For days after Gretchen's disappearance, detectives got a new lead. A resident of Westchester, located 30 minutes away from Brumal, called the police and said that he had found children's shorts matching the description of Gretchen's clothing. Investigators immediately showed them to Gretchen's mother, but she said they didn't belong to her daughter. From then on, there was no progress in the case for several weeks. The police called off the search operation and focused on the investigation. They continued interviewing people, following up on any available leads, but with each passing day, their hope of finding Gretchen alive diminished. This continued for 2 months, until October 14th, when a chilling call came in to the police. A man went for a jog in a large national park, about a 20-minute drive from Brumal. There, he noticed something strange in the bushes. At first, he didn't realize what it was. But when he came closer, he suddenly realized it was a human body. He immediately ran to the park rangers to inform them of the discovery, and they called the police. Officers quickly realized the remains were those of a child, but due to the extent of decomposition, identifying the child was extremely challenging. Detectives assumed it might be Gretchen, so they showed her parents photos of the clothing, which had been left carefully folded next to the remains. Gretchen's mother immediately confirmed they belonged to her daughter because she had made those clothes herself. Soon, forensic experts confirmed it was indeed Gretchen by matching the remains with her dental records. They also determined that the cause of death was multiple severe blows to the head, and the case was reclassified as a homicide. Due to the level of decomposition, they couldn't determine any other details, including whether the victim had been sexually assaulted. Moreover, DNA analysis didn't exist in 1975, so investigators were once again left without any clues. News of the murder reignited the attention of the local community, and the police began receiving even more tips. People realized that a dangerous criminal could still be somewhere among them, so everyone wanted to see the perpetrator brought to justice as soon as possible. Investigators received dozens of tips about suspicious men spotted in the park area where Gretchen's body was found, but all these tips led to dead ends. They also checked everyone living within a few-mile radius who had a history of violent crimes, but this yielded no results either. Several months after the discovery of the body, the case completely stalled, and there were no developments since then. Over the following years, the investigation was reopened from time to time. Detectives reviewed all available tips and leads, but each time it ended nowhere. The main problem was that detectives had no evidence at all. Even when the police began using DNA analysis, it didn't help in this particular case because no foreign samples were found on Gretchen's remains or her clothing. As a result, the case remained unsolved for many decades. It was occasionally mentioned in newspapers and featured on TV, but only in recent years did Gretchen's murder once again reignite wide public attention. 2 journalists, Joanna and Mike, decided to write a book about the crime. They worked on it for several years, gathering all available information piece by piece and trying to uncover new facts. Both journalists grew up in Brumal and were roughly the same age as Gretchen at the time of her murder. Joanna, who was only 9 at the time, remembered it pretty well because it not only impacted her life, but also the entire town. After Gretchen's disappearance, children could no longer roam the streets or leave home unsupervised. They all feared that the perpetrator might strike again, and this fear haunted them for many years. Even young children couldn't help but feel how their lives had suddenly changed, so they all remembered Gretchen's murder throughout the years. To write the book, Joanna and Mike secured access to the case documents and spoke with many individuals involved in the case. They carefully pieced together the events of those days, detailing the entire story. This book was released in 2022 and immediately attracted significant attention to the case. However, its major impact came months later when a woman contacted the police to discuss Gretchen's case. She met with the leading detective to tell her story. The woman said that she was 10 years old at the time of the murder and lived in Havertone, just a short distance from Gretchen's home. She was friends with Gretchen and her older sisters, as well as numerous other kids in the area. She often slept over at her friends' houses. And one night, something horrifying happened. While she was staying at the house of 2 sisters, she woke up in the middle of the night to someone touching her. When she opened her eyes, she saw their father in front of her, who quickly left the room. She was afraid to tell anyone about it and stayed in this house for another night. The same thing happened again. Her friend's father entered the bedroom and started touching her. The following morning, she finally told one of the sisters what had happened. To her surprise, she answered that it happened quite frequently. The girl also said that her father sometimes came to her sister at night. When she returned home, she told her parents everything. However, instead of going to the police, they simply prohibited her from visiting her friend's house anymore. And all of this happened just a week before Gretchen's disappearance. After telling her story, the woman finally disclosed the name of this man. It was David Zanstra, the same pastor who taught at the Sunday school. But that wasn't the end of her story. She also revealed that a month after Gretchen's disappearance, one of her friends was twice approached by a man who attempted to abduct her. The girl refused to get into his car and later told her friends that it was Zanstra who tried to lure her somewhere. To corroborate her statement, the woman showed detectives her personal diary from that time. On September 15, 1975, she wrote about her friend's plea to keep it a secret, fearing that David Zanstra might harm her. After receiving this information, the police immediately reopened the investigation. Upon reviewing the case materials, detectives uncovered several suspicious facts that indirectly implicated David. As we remember, it was he who reported Gretchen's disappearance to the police. The pastor provided investigators with a detailed description of her clothing: dark blue zip-up shorts with front studs and pockets without zippers or buttons. He also mentioned that she wore a white top with her hair in braids. At the same time, he claimed not to have seen Gretchen that day. This raised a reasonable question. How could he know what clothes she wore that morning? Especially since, after her body was found, David's descriptions were confirmed. She was wearing those exact clothes. The detectives also learned that the Sunday school classes started about 50 minutes late because Zanstra didn't show up at the church at the usual time. It meant that he would have had enough time to abduct Gretchen, murder her, dispose of her body in the park, and return to the church to begin his lessons. According to David's testimony, which he provided right after Gretchen's disappearance, he drove some of the children in his van to her father's church after the Sunday school classes. He insisted he didn't see Gretchen that morning and only noticed her absence when her father brought it to his attention. Another intriguing fact was that David, along with his wife and 3 children, moved to another state just a few months after the disappearance. The pastor also owned several vehicles, one of which was a green station wagon. As we recall, a witness told the police they saw a similar vehicle approaching a girl near the church on the day Gretchen disappeared. Piecing together all this information, the detectives decided to speak with the man. At that time, he was 83 years old and lived in Georgia, so they drove there. On July 17, 2023, they met with him at the police station and began questioning him. When Zanstra realized the detectives suspected him of murder, he began to deny everything, asking them what exactly they got against him. They told him they had the testimony of a woman he had touched during a sleepover at his house, as well as a story about him molesting his own daughters. Upon hearing this, David was stunned, and pretty soon his demeanor changed completely. Understanding that his dirty secrets were exposed, he stopped denying, and 48 years after the murder, he began to speak. According to his account, that morning he drove to Gretchen's father's church in his green American motor station wagon and saw the girl leaving her house. Waiting until there were no witnesses around, he approached her and offered her a ride. Without any hesitation, Gretchen got into his car. She knew David well because their families were friends, and she was also on her way to his Sunday school classes. But instead of taking her to the church, he drove her to a deserted park area, stopped the car, and told her to undress. Gretchen refused and said she wanted to go home, so Zanstra struck her several times on the head, causing her to lose consciousness. The pastor removed her clothes, satisfied himself, and then drove her to another park. Unable to find a pulse on her, he carried her body into the bushes and covered it with branches. After that, David drove back to the church to start his classes. Upon hearing his confession, the police arrested Zanstra for Gretchen's murder and extradited him to Pennsylvania. He was placed in jail awaiting trial, but for the police, this was just the beginning of a much deeper investigation. Considering that Zanstra had assaulted at least several girls, detectives strongly believed that there were likely other victims. The situation was worsened by the fact that the man worked as a pastor in many different cities and states for decades, so he could have committed numerous other crimes. Most of the time, he worked with children and he was deeply respected in society, which could have allowed him to avoid any suspicions. But now, when the truth finally came out, detectives took his DNA sample and began searching for matches in other unsolved cases. They also looked into unsolved disappearances of girls in the cities where David had been working. Unfortunately, it didn't take long to find the first possible connection. Investigators quickly came across the disappearance of 4-year-old Amanda Campbell from California, which occurred in 1991. Like Gretchen, she walked out of her home in a quiet neighborhood and vanished without a trace. At the time, David Zanstra worked as a pastor in that same neighborhood. Right now, there is no evidence against him, but the police say this case has several striking similarities to Gretchen's abduction and the pastor could be the same perpetrator. They are also continuing to investigate his possible involvement in other crimes. Considering that all of this is happening right now, we may learn a lot more in the coming months. As for the trial for the murder of Gretchen, it has not yet begun. It is possible that David's lawyers will want to prolong the process and advise him to retract his confession. In that case, the trial could drag on for years and there are no guarantees that the man will live to see the verdict. Alright guys, share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching. A girl left the gym and headed home just a few hundred yards away, but she never made it, sparking a massive police search. Over time, this case turned into one of the most notorious in modern Italy, leaving millions in shock. No one could have imagined that the twists and turns of this story would rival any detective movie, or that something like this could happen in real life. Yara Gambaradio was born on May 21, 1997, in a small Italian town called Bambe di Sopra. This quiet place, not far from Milan, has a population of just over 7,000 people and is known for its peaceful life, old architecture, and beautiful nature. Yara's family had lived there for generations. She had loving parents, an older sister, and 2 younger brothers. Yara loved her hometown. She went to the local school, had lots of friends, and was very active in gymnastics. Just a few hundred yards from her home was a big sports center, and Yara went there almost every week. On November 26, 2010, when she was 13, she planned to swing by the gym quickly to return a stereo to her coach. Around 5:15 p.m., she said goodbye to her parents and headed out, saying she'd be back in about an hour. Yara's parents weren't worried about letting her go out alone, despite her age. Their town was very safe, and the walk to the gym only took a few minutes. But that evening, they started to get concerned because Yara was late. By 7 p.m., she still hadn't come back, which was unusual. At 7 to 11, her mom tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. This really worried her parents, so they immediately contacted the police. The case was referred to a police department in a larger nearby city, about 7 miles away, and an experienced detective, Letizia Ruggieri, was assigned to handle Yara's disappearance. She immediately sent officers to the town to start the search and also called in the military police for help. After talking with Yara's parents, they went to the gym to piece together her last movements. Yara's coach confirmed she had come by around 5:30 p.m. Her friends also said they saw Yara, chatted with her, watched her do some exercises, and then saw her leave for home. The police also learned that at 6:44 p.m., Yara had sent a text to a friend, which was the last time anyone heard from her. So, the investigators determined that Yara disappeared somewhere between the sports complex and her home on her way back. They split into several groups, with one combing the streets and another searching for witnesses and other clues, like CCTV footage. Several people who were near the sports center that evening reported seeing a girl who looked like Yara. They said she was speaking with two men near a red car, but the police couldn't confirm if it was really her. They searched the entire sports center but didn't find Yara. Meanwhile, local and military police officers were scouring the streets, fields, and the banks of a small river running through the town. Firefighters and volunteers also joined the search, but no one could find Yara. The detective then called in canine units. The search dogs picked up Yara's scent from her belongings, but instead of leading the police from the sports center towards her home, the dogs indicated that Yara had moved in the opposite direction, towards a small town called Mapello. Letizia also requested Yara's cell phone location data, which showed that her phone had connected to a tower in Mapello at 6:49 p.m., just 5 minutes after she sent a text to her friend. Given the distance from the sports center, it was almost certain that Yara couldn't have gotten there on foot, so she must have been transported by a vehicle. At this point, Yara's trail went cold, and the police had two main theories. The first, and most likely, was that she had been kidnapped. The second was that she might have run away, but there were serious doubts about this. In her last message, she had made plans to meet a friend the next day, making it hard to believe she would decide to run away just minutes later. Despite their doubts, the investigator interviewed all of Yara's relatives and friends, but nothing indicated any issues at home. Letizia ordered wiretaps on the phones of all family members and several dozen other people. She took a bold step and requested cell phone location data for every phone that was in Mapello on the evening of Yara's disappearance. If it was indeed a kidnapping, the perpetrator's phone would have connected to the towers in the area, but identifying the culprit would still be extremely challenging. In total, the police received information on 15,000 phones that were in the town that evening. They attempted to scrutinize each of these individuals, and a special team was set up to monitor thousands of numbers that seemed suspicious for various reasons. Meanwhile, active searches for Yara continued, but day after day, they yielded no results. Letizia began to doubt that they would make any progress this way, and her last hope rested on the cell phone numbers, one of which had to belong to the kidnapper. Within a few days, the police had listened to thousands of hours of phone conversations, but none of them were related to Yara's disappearance. This continued until late November, when one of the officers suddenly heard a highly suspicious phrase. A man on the phone said, "Forgive me, Lord, I didn't kill her." Investigators quickly identified the man as Mohammed Fikri, a construction worker from Morocco who lived in the same town where Yara's phone signal had last been detected. The police tried to locate him, but there was a problem. The team monitoring the phone conversations was listening to recordings with a few days' delay because it was impossible to process so many calls in real time. Fikri's call was only heard 3 days after it was made, and by the time the police became interested in him, he was already on a ship heading to Morocco. All of this looked extremely suspicious, so the Italian authorities decided to intercept the ship. They found the man, arrested him, and brought him back to Italy. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered another chilling clue. They found Fikri's car and discovered a mattress with bloodstains in the trunk. The mattress was immediately sent to the lab, but here the police faced an unexpected twist. The blood didn't belong to Yara and apparently wasn't even human. Upon further analysis of the cell phone recording, it was revealed that Fikri had said something completely different in his native language, and the officer had mistranslated the second part of the phrase. After conducting additional checks, investigators confirmed that Fikri had nothing to do with Yara's disappearance, and they had to release him. By that time, Yara's case had become one of the most well-known topics across Italy, with extensive coverage in the national media. Millions of people followed the search efforts, hoping she would be found alive. When news of Fikri's arrest hit the papers, many were convinced that the kidnapper had finally been caught, so the news of his innocence came as a shock and disappointment. It meant the investigators were back to square one, with no other leads to help them find Yara. The police continued to monitor phone conversations, search for other evidence, and do everything they could, but nothing seemed to lead anywhere. This continued for exactly 3 months, until February 26, 2011. On that day, a man from a small town 6 miles from Yara's home went to one of the many nearby fields to fly his remote-controlled airplane. But the airplane had some issues and he had to land it in a spot with tall, thick grass to prevent it from crashing into the ground. When he went to retrieve it, he noticed a pile of rags. At first, he didn't think much of it, but then he saw boots sticking out from under the pile and decided to call the police. Officers found a human body under the rags, but the level of decomposition made it almost impossible to visually identify the victim. However, when Letizia arrived at the scene, she immediately knew. It was Yara. She was wearing the same clothes she had on when she went to the sports complex 3 months earlier. Near the body, they also found her iPad, house keys, SIM card, and the removable battery from her cell phone. But the phone itself was nowhere to be found. Italy's most renowned forensic pathologist was brought in to examine the remains and concluded that the cause of death was multiple stab wounds. She also found no signs of assault, but the fact that some of her clothing was removed led investigators to suggest that this was the motive. Experts also found fibers on the body that were commonly used in a specific type of fabric. This suggested that the killer might work in a related manufacturing facility somewhere in the area. Additionally, they found 2 foreign DNA samples, one on the victim's gloves and another on the battery of her smartphone. However, there were several issues. The samples were quite small, making it difficult to extract a full profile. There were also no matches in the various databases. So, the investigators found themselves at another dead end. But 2 months later, Letizia received an unexpected call. Experts from the lab reported that, upon further investigation of the victim's belongings, they had discovered biological material on her underwear, and the analysis yielded a full DNA profile of an unknown man. With the killer's DNA in hand, Letizia divided the officers into different teams and assigned them specific tasks. Some were responsible for collecting DNA samples from all of Yara's relatives, acquaintances, and everyone at the sports complex. Others focused on analyzing cell phone location data, compiling a list of numbers belonging to people who traveled from Yara's town to Mapello that evening, and then collecting their DNA samples. Given the scale of these tasks, she had to wait weeks for results, which were slow in coming. Even with 3 laboratories across Italy working on the DNA samples, the process could take years. In the following months, the police collected thousands of DNA samples, but none matched the killer's profile. Meanwhile, Letitia kept thinking how to get new leads, and soon she had an idea. Not far from the field where Yara's body was found, there was a nightclub. Letizia knew that killers often leave their victims' bodies in familiar areas, and this club had a reputation for being a hot spot for people with criminal records and other shady individuals. So, she decided to try this theory and collect DNA samples from all the visitors of that nightclub. Letizia assigned several officers to stand guard at the nightclub on Fridays and Saturdays, collecting DNA samples from everyone entering. Since all club-goers had membership cards, investigators could access information on everyone who had visited the club in the past. Although Letizia knew the chances of success were slim, she wanted to try everything in her power due to the lack of other leads. And soon she received a call from the lab. DNA from one of the visitors matched the killer's profile. The man's name was Damiano, but there was a problem. The match was only partial and Damiano was quickly cleared as a suspect since he was on another continent at the time of Yara's disappearance. But still, this was a significant breakthrough. Experts assumed that since his DNA only partially matched the killer's profile, Damiano must be related to the actual perpetrator. Letizia and her team began investigating Damiano's family to identify the most likely suspect. Since this was before genetic genealogy became common in criminal investigations, this method was new and extremely challenging. They soon made a surprising discovery. Damiano's mother had worked as a housekeeper for Yara's family for 10 years but left the job a few years ago. When she found out that someone from her family might be the killer, the woman was deeply shocked. Despite this revelation, the search for the suspect dragged on for many months. Letizia eventually concluded that none of Damiano's immediate relatives were Yara's murderer, which meant they would need to investigate hundreds if not thousands of distant relatives. As months passed without progress, the media began accusing Letizia and her team of incompetence and reluctance to work on the case. Several politicians joined in, trying to have the detective removed, but they were unsuccessful. Despite the heavy pressure, Letizia continued to do everything in her power to identify the killer. She and her team examined various family trees and archival records dating back to 1716. They had to review thousands of individuals, repeatedly hitting dead ends. This continued until September 2011 when investigators finally made a breakthrough. One family tree led them to a man named Giuseppe who was already deceased. However, his widow had preserved some postmarks with his saliva and experts managed to extract a DNA profile. The results showed that Giuseppe was very likely the father or grandfather of the killer whose DNA was found on the victim's underwear. Giuseppe had 2 sons, and investigators obtained their DNA samples, but they faced another unexpected disappointment. Although the results showed a close match, neither of the sons was the killer. This left Letizia stumped. The killer had to be closely related to this family, but none of the male members showed a complete match. The only remaining possibility was that Giuseppe might have had a child with another woman, a child his family knew nothing about. Detectives focused on this lead, but uncovering such sensitive information proved extremely difficult. They interviewed thousands of people who might have known or seen Giuseppe during his lifetime. Nearly a year later, they got an intriguing clue. Since the 1960s, Giuseppe had been visiting a spa complex in a small town near Milan without his wife. He stayed there for 2 weeks every May and never brought his family along. Letizia requested records of all visitors to the spa complex during those years. To her surprise, these documents were still available and investigators began examining them. They compiled a list of all the women who stayed at the spa during the same time as Giuseppe. This process stretched over a year, but Letizia still couldn't get any closer to identifying Giuseppe's possible lover. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of what they were doing, and the theory about a secret child sparked widespread interest across Italy. Journalists, eager to capitalize on this attention, began their own searches for children born from extramarital affairs. To their surprise, they uncovered many such stories. In one small village, for example, they found 5 such children. This continued until 2014, when investigators finally made some progress. With the widespread attention on the case and the search for Giuseppe's possible lover, the police received numerous tips, but all of them led to dead ends. But in the summer of that year, they received a tip suggesting that Giuseppe might have had an affair with a woman named Esther Artsify. Reviewing their records, investigators suddenly discovered that they had already collected a DNA sample from Esther 2 years earlier. However, the results showed she was not related to the killer. Still, Letizia decided to request a new analysis, and the results were shocking. It turned out that the initial expert had mistakenly compared the killer's DNA with Yara's DNA instead of Esther's. When a different expert re-examined the correct samples, they found that Esther was indeed the killer's mother. With the long-awaited confirmation in hand, Letizia discovered that Esther had 3 children, including twins, a boy and a girl, who fit the age profile. Although the twins were considered the children of Esther's legal husband, investigators suspected that in reality, Giuseppe was the biological father. Since the killer was clearly male, they focused on Esther's son. At the time of the investigation, he was 42 years old, worked as a construction worker, and lived with his wife and children in Marpello, the same town where Yara's cell phone signal had disappeared. Letizia quickly came up with a plan to obtain his DNA sample without spooking him. She learned that he used a specific road every day and arranged a sobriety checkpoint there. The man, unaware of the real reason, blew into the breathalyzer, which was immediately sent to the lab with his saliva. Almost 4 years after the murder, Letizia finally received long-awaited confirmation. His DNA fully matched the biological sample found on Yara's underwear. This man's name was Massimo Bassetti, and on June 16, he was finally arrested. Bassetti denied any involvement in the crime and claimed he was innocent, so the case went to trial. During the preparations, investigators uncovered several alarming facts that indirectly implicated Bassetti. His browser history showed searches of an unaccepted nature related to minors. On the evening of Yara's disappearance, his cell phone was located in her town but was turned off at 5:45 p.m. and not turned on again until the next morning. Bassetti's car was captured on surveillance footage near the sports center on the same evening, just minutes before Yara vanished. The car had no license plates, making it difficult to identify the driver before Bassetti's arrest. Now, it was confirmed to be Bassetti's vehicle. Interestingly, fibers from his car seat matched the fibers found on the victim's body. The prosecution also called a witness who lived in Yara's town. The woman testified that on the evening of the disappearance, she had gone outside to take out the trash when she saw a car speeding by her house. According to her description, the vehicle resembled Bassetti's car and she saw a child inside. She added that she heard screams coming from the car. Police also discovered that Bassetti frequently stopped at a pizza restaurant on the same street as Yara's home. This suggested that he might have seen her long before the abduction and possibly had been planning the crime in advance. Regarding the surveillance footage, Bassetti claimed he was simply driving home from work that evening, but investigators found that he did not work that day, which was confirmed by his colleagues' testimonies, CCTV footage, and cell phone location data. The trial began in the summer of 2015, a year after Bassetti's arrest, and it quickly captured the attention of millions across Italy. While most people were sure that Bassetti was the killer, no one could have anticipated the twists this trial would reveal. The prosecution's version was clear. Bassetti had likely been watching Yara for days or even weeks before deciding to abduct her after she left the sports complex alone. He then took her to the field where her body was later discovered and killed her. The main theory was that Bassetti had intended to assault her, but for some reason he didn't go through with it. Bassetti's wife testified that he was home with the family having dinner at the time Yara went missing, but this was contradicted by CCTV footage near the sports complex and 3 witnesses who saw Bassetti's car at the time he claimed to be at home. The defense argued that their client was innocent. Bassetti himself claimed he often had nosebleeds, which could have gotten on his clothes and tools. His lawyer suggested that the real killer might have somehow come into contact with Bassetti's blood before the crime, which then ended up on the victim's underwear. The defense also challenged the DNA evidence, claiming that a mistake might have been made. They explained that there are 2 types of DNA, one that changes significantly between relatives and another one that changes very slowly over generations. The DNA found on the victim's underwear was of the slower changing type, so the defense argued that it could belong to anyone related to Bassetti, whether close or distant. But the prosecution's experts countered this, insisting that Bassetti's DNA matched the evidence beyond any doubt. But that wasn't the defense's main argument. During the trial, they dropped a bombshell that caused a huge stir. They named a new suspect, a gym instructor named Sylvia. It turned out that after the body was discovered, experts found Sylvia's blood on the sleeve of Yara's jacket. Sylvia's father revealed that when she came home after Yara's disappearance, she had been crying all night. Investigators also discovered that Sylvia had sent a few messages to her brother on that evening, but both of them deleted it shortly after, so the content of the messages remained unknown. Sylvia herself claimed she couldn't remember why she acted that way, what she had written to her brother, or how her blood ended up on Yara's clothing. In court, she refused to answer questions, just saying, "I don't know." Despite the lack of any clear explanation for these unexpected revelations, there was enough evidence to convict Bassetti. In the summer of 2016, he was sentenced to life in prison, and his lawyers were unable to overturn the verdict. It's worth mentioning that the day after the verdict, his wife visited him in prison and confessed that none of their 3 children were his, admitting she had been unfaithful with several other men. It's also notable that Esther's third child wasn't from her legal husband or Giuseppe, but from another man. Since then, Bassetti has remained in prison, but the story of Sylvia and her blood continues to trouble many who followed the case. Some people find it so suspicious that they question Bassetti's guilt and suggest that he might have been wrongfully accused, with the DNA evidence potentially being manipulated. Nevertheless, this case remains one of the most high-profile in modern Italian history, and all evidence was carefully examined by the country's leading experts, making the likelihood of Bassetti's innocence extremely low. A girl went to a store just a few minutes away from her house, but she never came back. The police started their search, and over the course of the investigation, they uncovered some pretty strange clues. Still, the mystery remained unsolved for decades until the truth came out in a completely unexpected way. Christy Wesselman was born on April 19, 1970 in Glen Ellen, Illinois. She lived there with her mom, 2 older brothers, and a sister. Their town was considered one of the safest in the area, and Christy loved spending time outside. She'd spend hours wandering the streets with other kids from the neighborhood. At school, Christy was popular and had a lot of friends. She was actively involved in school life and even got elected as vice president of her class. On top of that, she played volleyball and softball. In the summer of 1985, 15-year-old Christy was taking summer classes at school and spent most of her free time hanging out with friends. On July 21st, Christy came home from school around 3:30 p.m. Right after getting home, she decided to walk to a local store to grab a soda and a chocolate bar for herself and her mom. Her mother expected her back in just a few minutes since the store was close by. But as time went on, it became clear something was wrong because Christy wasn't coming home. At first, her mom thought she might have run into some friends and gone off with them. Back then, there were no cell phones, so she couldn't check in with Christy and had no choice but to wait. As evening set in, her worry only grew. She called Christy's friends, but none of them had seen her that day. Growing desperate, she headed to the store herself, scanning the streets along the way. But there was no sign of Christy anywhere. Christy's family spent the next several hours searching for her, but when there was still no sign of her by 1:50 a.m., her mother decided to contact the police. Officers quickly joined the search, starting by piecing together Christy's last known movements. First, they spoke with the clerk at the store she'd visited. The man knew Christy well. He lived nearby and had even babysat her when she was younger. He confirmed that Christy had come by around 4 p.m., picked up some chocolate bars, and left. She didn't mention where she was headed, but the clerk noted that she seemed happy and nothing about her behavior struck him as unusual. Police also found a few other witnesses who had seen Christy at the store, but none of them could recall where she went after that. Investigators spoke to all of Christy's friends, considering the possibility that she might have lost track of time while hanging out with some of them, but none of her friends had seen her that day. The police then focused all their resources on the search and began combing through the streets. But by that time, it was already the middle of the night, making the search even more challenging. Despite their determination, there was no trace of Christy, no clues, no leads, nothing. The search continued through the early morning, and by midday, a new group of officers took over. One of them suggested trying to retrace Christy's likely route. He guessed that she had probably taken the shortest path from her house to the store, a shortcut through a nearby field. Back then, there was a large vacant lot with tall grass between the residential area and the store. Walking around it would take quite a bit of time. For adults driving cars, it wasn't an issue, but local kids who frequented the store or the nearby McDonald's always took a shortcut through the field, where a narrow path had been worn into the grass. The detective decided to follow this trail. As he made his way along it, something unusual caught his eye in the grass. Pushing through the overgrowth, he realized it was a human body, and he quickly recognized Christy. He immediately called for backup, and the body was handed over to the medical examiners for further analysis. Forensic specialists combed through the crime scene for any evidence, but their search came up empty. No footprints, no personal belongings, nothing to help explain what had happened. The medical examiners determined that Christy had died from 8 stab wounds. They also found evidence of SA and collected the perpetrator's biological material. But in 1985, DNA testing was still in its infancy and not commonly used in criminal investigations. So, with no way to analyze it, the sample was stored for future use. Christie's mother also helped police piece together another interesting detail. Christie had been wearing a pearl ring on her finger that day. However, the ring was nowhere to be found, neither on her body nor at the crime scene. Detectives concluded that the killer might have taken it and instructed all officers to keep an eye on pawnshops in case the murderer tried to sell it. With no physical evidence to work with, the police focused on finding potential witnesses who might have seen Christie or the killer near the field. They managed to track down several people who had used the same path around the estimated time of the murder, but none of them reported seeing anything suspicious. It was quite weird because Christie's body was just a few yards off the trail, although it was hidden by the tall grass, making it nearly impossible to spot. Investigators also learned that just a few dozen yards from where Christie's body was found, a family had been hosting a barbecue in their backyard. But despite being so close to the scene, none of them remembered hearing or seeing anything out of the ordinary. An employee at a gas station about 60 yards from the field also worked his entire shift that day, but didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. To the police, the situation seemed bizarre. So many people had been near the crime scene, yet no one saw or heard anything. Investigators theorized that the unknown attacker either followed Christie from the store to the field or encountered her on the path. He likely led her just a few yards into the tall grass and killed her, all without making a sound. Detectives considered the possibility that Christie might have known her killer, which could explain why there were no screams. After all, their town was small and many residents knew each other. Police began investigating all the men who knew Christie, but this effort led nowhere. They also compiled a list of men in the area with prior convictions for violent crimes. Several suspects were reviewed, but none of them could be tied to the murder. For several months, the police made little progress in solving the mystery. They continued following up on tips and investigating new suspects, but every lead brought them to a dead end. This dragged on for 3 long years until an unexpected breakthrough came in 1988. By that time, DNA analysis was becoming a key tool in criminal investigations. Detectives decided to collect DNA samples from everyone who had been a potential suspect in Christie's case over the years. Many agreed to cooperate, and none of their samples matched the biological evidence found at the scene. But there was one person who refused to provide a DNA sample. Dana Henry, a 34-year-old man living near the field where Christie was found, had been on the police's radar from the first days of the investigation. At the time, Henry denied having anything to do with the crime. But now his refusal to give a sample made detectives seriously question his innocence. The police decided to seek a court order to obtain his DNA. Henry appeared at the court hearing and continued to insist he was innocent. However, he was charged with contempt of court and held in a local jail cell for several days. Only after that, Henry agreed to provide his DNA sample. In the end, his DNA didn't match the killer's sample, and Henry was released. Once he was out, he told reporters that he had been held in a jail cell without clothing and was only released after he gave in to the immense pressure and reluctantly agreed to provide a sample. Henry said he spent around $50,000 on legal fees, a significant amount of money at the time. He had to mortgage his home, which he eventually lost, and many of his friends and family turned their backs on him. Frustrated and angry, Henry filed a lawsuit against the police department, but it didn't seem to lead anywhere. Even after DNA evidence cleared his name, some people still believed he was guilty. Years later, Henry admitted to reporters that the whole ordeal had ruined his life, even though he was never formally charged with a crime. For another year, Christie's case remained at a standstill until 1989, when an unexpected twist brought it back into the spotlight. A judge issued a restraining order against a local man who had been bombarding the victim's family with tips about who he believed was responsible for Christie's murder. The man, named Willis, first contacted Christie's relatives in late 1985. He claimed to have information about the killer's identity and started sending them various leads. Each tip was investigated by the police, but every time, it turned out to be either far-fetched or completely irrelevant to the case. This dragged on for almost 4 years until Christie's family couldn't take it anymore. They filed a complaint and a judge issued an order barring Willis from ever contacting them again. Following the restraining order, police decided to investigate Willis himself, but they found no evidence linking him to the crime. In 2000, the killer's DNA was uploaded to the FBI database, but no matches were found. The case remained cold for many years. From time to time, the police revisited it, following up on tips, but they never got any closer to catching the killer. This went on for 3 entire decades. Over the years, the original detectives had all retired or moved on, and Christie's case had been assigned to a new team. Then, in 2015, something completely unexpected happened. One day, they got a notification from the FBI database. The DNA sample from Christie's killer perfectly matched a recently uploaded profile. The DNA belonged to a 62-year-old man named Michael Jones, who lived in a small town called Champaign, about 150 miles from Christie's home. Jones's DNA was added to the database after he was arrested for domestic violence. His wife had reported him to the police, which led to his arrest according to an Illinois law passed in 2002. Anyone suspected of a crime has to provide a DNA sample. Interestingly, the main advocate for this law was the state's attorney from the same county where Christie's murder took place. And this particular unsolved case had been a major factor in his push to get this legislation passed. As soon as the DNA match came through, investigators jumped into action, looking into Michael Jones. The first thing that stood out was that his name had never been mentioned in the case before. He wasn't a suspect, a witness, or even someone remotely connected to the investigation. The detectives simply hadn't known he existed. Michael Jones had a long criminal history. His first run-in with the law came in the mid-70s when he assaulted a woman. But for some unknown reason, he apparently avoided any real consequences. Just a year later, Jones attacked a 27-year-old woman, assaulted her, and left her in a hospital parking lot. When police issued a warrant for his arrest, Michael turned himself in. During his trial, he expressed deep regret for his actions and claimed he had a great respect for the law. That's why he surrendered voluntarily. Jones also insisted that he suffered from serious mental health issues and needed professional help. However, an independent psychiatrist determined that he was fully aware of his actions. As a result, Jones was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. As you might have guessed, Michael was released early for good behavior. He ended up serving just 6 years of his sentence and was back on the streets by 1983, 2 years before Christie's murder. What's even more striking is that his victim wasn't informed of his early release. Later, she stated that had she known, she would have done everything in her power to challenge the decision. A year after his release, Michael got married. But in 1994, his first wife left him and secured a restraining order against him. The reason? He had been showing an unhealthy interest in one of her young relatives. But despite this alarming behavior, no formal charges were ever filed. In 1999, Michael was arrested again, this time for assaulting a family member of his new girlfriend. Detectives also learned that Michael often went on long solo motorcycle trips and frequently visited relatives in Chicago. Given that Christie's town was on the outskirts of his route, it's possible he passed through the area while traveling to see his family. If that was the case, it would explain why he never appeared on the detectives' radar. If Michael was just passing through for a few hours, tracking his presence would have been nearly impossible. Christie's mother said she had never heard his name before. When police first called her to ask about Michael, she didn't think much of it. Over the past 30 years, investigators had contacted her many times with questions, so this just felt like another routine inquiry. But everything changed when police obtained a fresh DNA sample from Michael while he was in prison and confirmed once and for all that he was the killer. They visited Christie's mother in person to deliver the news. After all these years, the man responsible for her daughter's murder had finally been caught. Before formally charging Michael with Christie's murder, detectives spoke with his ex-girlfriend and uncovered more details about him. She described Michael as someone with a volatile temperament. He could be calm one moment and then suddenly fly into a rage for no apparent reason. She also mentioned that he was obsessed with detective books and crime shows on TV. This information led investigators to suspect that Michael might not just be responsible for Christie's murder, but potentially other unsolved crimes as well. His frequent solo trips, criminal tendencies, and fascination with crime stories hinted that he might have known how to cover his tracks and avoid leaving evidence behind. After building their case against Michael, police officially charged him on September 18, 2015, and Michael denied any involvement in Christie's murder. The case eventually went to court, but the wait dragged on for 3 long years. The trial didn't start until 2018. Prosecutors sought a life sentence, but in the end, Michael decided to plead guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence. As part of the deal, he wasn't required to reveal any details about the crime, but with the DNA evidence, there was no question about his guilt. As a result, the judge sentenced him to 80 years in prison, with the possibility of parole no earlier than 2095. In other words, Michael will likely never walk free again. Christie's family thanked the investigators for finally bringing the case to a close. Christie's mother also expressed her frustration over Michael's early release in 1983. She pointed out that if he had served his full 10-year sentence, he wouldn't have had the chance to attack her daughter and Christie would still be alive today. Henry, the man initially suspected of the crime, also attended the trial of the real killer. In a later interview, he shared that the accusations had ruined his life, and even decades later, he still hadn't fully recovered. He hoped that seeing justice served would help him heal, but it didn't. Henry also revealed that throughout all these years, no one from the police department ever apologized to him, let alone faced any consequences for the damage they had caused to his life. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video.